I know we have a lot of content to cover today and lots of really excited attendees with lots of questions. So we'll go ahead and dive in. Dr. Flynn, you lead Northeastern's research initiative to inform and advance societal resilience. So before we dive deeper into today's session, what is societal resilience and how do you measure it?
Well, let me start maybe with a definition of resilience. And this is one that was developed actually at the end of the Obama administration and survived through the Trump administration, is still alive and well in the new Biden administration. And it captures, I think, key elements of resilience in terms of how we approach it at the Global Resilience Institute. And it's the ability to prepare for and adapt to changing conditions and withstand and recover rapidly from disruptions. Resilience also includes the ability to withstand and recover from deliberate attacks, accidents, or naturally occurring threats or incidents. This societal resilience basically is the ability to do all of that. And but again, I think is key about this definition is resilience isn't just about bouncing back from getting knocked down, right? It is, to be resilient, you should be prepared for those disruptions. And you want to be able to withstand, to think about how you could mitigate a likely disruption so it won't cause full harm. And when you do get knocked down, you want to get back up. And adaptation is key. You want to actually bounce forward, not bounce back. Every time we have a disruption, we should try to get to a better place, not try to get back to where we were before. So resilience applied at the societal level is being able to do all those things. But what we really find, of course, is that it really has to be attacked at multiple levels. Individuals need to be resilient, families, business and enterprises. And very, very importantly, and this is, I would argue, what drives the resilience imperative, is the systems and infrastructure we rely on, the networks we rely on, have to be designed with greater resilience. What we're seeing with a whole series of events in the headlines, like the Colonial Pipeline disruption, with the cyber attack, what we saw in the Suez Canal with the Ever Given getting stuck in the canal, a super container ship. These cascading effects are largely due to the fact that we are hyper connected. We are tied together in ways that we often don't understand until things fail. So a key element of resilience is getting out in front, understanding where your risks may lie, and being very effective, we hope, at both trying to mitigate it, but being skilled at recovery and adaptation, because the one constant in the 21st century will be disruption.
Judge Emmett, I'd love to hear your definition of resilience and how you would define it.
Since Steve just went through that lengthy explanation, my temptation is to say, me too. I follow him. But resilience to me, I came up with a little formula a few years ago that I won't go through all the details, but it's basically planning. Well, first, prevention. Do everything you can to prevent a disruption, and then preparation for the fact that you're going to have one. As Dr. Flynn just said, disruptions are going to be in our life. There's no way to do that. And then you have, how do you respond to them? And then how do you recover from the disruption? And all of those things are then multiplied, and I come more from the governmental level, by three factors. Number one, you have to have policies in place to take care of the question of resilience. But it doesn't do any good to just have a policy unless you prioritize that policy. We have a whole book full of policies, but if it's a low priority, it doesn't happen. And then all of those things are negated if you don't put the resources in. And usually that means finances. So if you look at an area like Houston, we know a hurricane is going to hit Houston, but yet, and we know floods are going to hit the Houston area. But if you follow Steve Kleinberg's survey that he does every year for the Kinder Institute, for example, right after Harvey, number one concern was flooding among the public. If you take that same poll today, it's down in the low single digits. But the next time a storm comes along, everybody's going to say, well, why weren't you ready for it? Well, because you didn't want us to raise your taxes to help pay for the mitigation that's needed. So, that little formula of 2 P's and 2 R's and multiplied by PPR is something that I follow, or I used to follow all the time, now I get to talk about it a lot.
Dr. Flynn, back to you. You mentioned when you were giving us your definition that certain programming and policies have survived multiple presidential administrations. So would love to hear more about the programs and even curriculum that's being developed or being deployed currently around critical resilience.
There's a lot happening right now, but we still are in some cases in a bit of early days of trying to pull it all together. Actually, from a public policy side, government side, governments have been embracing resilience, and it's not just the U.S. government. The UK government just announced its strategy for foreign policy and national security, where cornerstone was the issue of resilience. And similarly, the Australian government has a resilience focus. The European Union. Why is this all happening? Is because just like Judge Emmett, who is in the front lines in Harris County facing major disruptions and in the crosshairs, the folks who are dealing with this are saying we got to get our act up better than what we've been doing to date. This is just getting too costly on a number of things, including loss of life. So academia, to some extent, is catching up. We're trying to inform just what are the tools that will allow us to become more resilient. At the Global Resilience Institute, we've basically built them around 5 buckets of effort. And this is activity that's moving, that we're seeing in other universities and our national labs and so forth, addressing as well. I built them around the barriers that I call to resilience. I've yet to find anybody who is against resilience, who wants fragility and brittleness. It's actually in a very increasingly stratified polity. We actually find, whether you're on the left or right, people tend to like resilience. So why aren't we? Well, first, I would call it is risk illiteracy. I can't get you to be resilient about something if you don't think something bad is ever going to happen, or you don't understand the hazard, how it will play out in something you value, your home, your business, your community. So I may be aware of hurricanes, but how does it impact me? I'm aware of an outage of power. How does it impact me? So there's a risk literacy piece that's very, very important. And that's both understanding hazards and how hazards will impact things that we value. The second issue, the barrier, is we don't design things for resilient. We design things for efficiency. And so there's actually a tension there, because efficiency is often about wringing out redundancies, not spending so much money on stuff. And that's great for blue sky days, but it don't work well at all. They fail very badly when it gets dark out, and when it gets when you have the black swan-like events or other just even more standard disasters. So there is a big work underway in the engineering realm, how to design systems to better withstand disruption, to fail gracefully, to regenerate when they get knocked down. And then at the architect and urban planning level, how do you do this on a much bigger scale, on a community scale, on a regional scale? The third bucket is we have very few incentives to actually do this, as the judge was just laying out about, people's memory disappears off of floods. Well, if there are no incentives, nobody's going to adopt the best practices. So really understanding how do we create incentives? And those roughly are in 3 areas. One is insurance and reinsurance. That's a great way that drives our behavior. Another is the world of finance. If it's more expensive to borrow money by doing the smart thing, by doing the not smart thing rather than doing the smart thing, you tend to do the smart thing. So if we can get the finance piece, and then it's the public-private resources that are brought to bear. How do we make sure those also? So that third bucket is creating the economic incentives for this. Fourth is we're not organized for this at all. This is a jurisdictional nightmare. We deal with things in isolated sectors. We deal with them in isolated jurisdictions. So the governance issues are a challenge. And lastly is the training and education. How do we get ourselves so we can operate in this more complex environment? So there's actually great work going on in each of those spheres. And part of what we're trying to do at my institute with folks like Judge Emmett, who are helping me, is to integrate that together so that we actually can get the solution.
A follow-up question that came in from our chat. Jackie asked, how do we keep attention on prevention so that people are willing to invest in it? Both you and Judge Emmett mentioned, short-term memories, and how do we get people to understand that this is an ongoing effort that doesn't happen and needs preparation for those non-blue sky days? How do we increase that risk literacy?
Well, I'm not sure anybody has a good answer to that. because particularly in the political realm and the governmental realm, there are always new issues that come up, and that's what the public wants to focus on. And so being able to bring them back is very difficult. But I will say in Harris County, for example, my predecessor, Judge Robert Eccles, created the whole TranStar concept. And of course, it followed after the legislature said the county judge is the director of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. So he created a full-time team that works on it, regardless whether the public's paying attention or not. At least there was a governmental entity that was their job to keep that in focus. And I think that's about the best we can do. The public is always going to be tempted to go off to whatever the latest issue of the day is. And the biggest problem is still financial. Nobody likes to raise taxes. Nobody ever runs for office saying, elect me, I want to raise your taxes. I mean, if you're old enough to remember, Mondale tried to say that one time and it didn't work out so well for him. He said, I'll be honest with you, I'm going to raise your taxes. Well, that wasn't a good thing to say. But the reality is, after Harvey, if you look, we were able to pass the largest bond package ever, $2.5 billion, because we did it a year after when it was still on people's minds. I'm not sure if you tried to pass that today, it would pass. But so you have to sort of strike when it's on people's minds. And then like right now, we're at the beginning of hurricane season. We've had a freeze, and you may think, well, a freeze and a hurricane are totally different. No, disasters kind of help each other, sort of. So being able to tell people we didn't invest in the infrastructure to winterize the electric grid in Texas. Now we need to make sure that we take all the steps necessary to prepare for hurricanes. And that you can take that earlier example and then use it for hurricane season. But as we all know, we spend a lot of time talking about hurricanes, but we have fires, we have chemical spills, we have all kinds of, well, now we've had a pandemic. Nobody could have seen that one coming 5 years ago. And that's been the biggest disruptor in recent memory. So you have to take each one as they come along and then build on the previous ones.
I think one area where this is, there's headway is actually increasingly in the private sector with major corporations who are investing significantly in enterprise resilience. And the reason why, it's a competitive advantage. It's almost to the advantage of a corporation to have a disruption if they're resilient, because their competitors basically don't perform as well. What happens is, if the more resilient enterprise actually gets market share, because customers abandon those who can't deliver the service. Recognizing that disruptions are more frequent, more likely to be intense, this is basically leading to the recognition. This is not basically a cost center. This is something we want to invest in to position the company. And enterprises who do this right, that make it organic to the way they operate, function better on blue sky days. They're actually just better run companies. And so it's that people are working out of the stovepipe. They're more nimble, they're more capable. The same thing could apply to our communities. One of the things that we know about resilience is that it's a bottom-up inclusive effort to get it. I can't direct resilience on a community, on a neighborhood. I can't get there from here. And it turns out when you actually build it, you have social capital. You actually have the thing that makes the community a place you want to live in and be a part of. And it also helps to break down some of the partisan barriers here, because if we're all in this together, and we are all in this together, there's a reason that we should all start to bring each other's strengths to the table. The last thing I'll say about this, there is one barrier I would suggest about the body politic sort of not getting its act together on emergency management or being prepared. It's part of the blame lies actually what I call the professional protector challenge. And it is that the pros often push back on amateurs doing their work. And so it's like, hey, you need the pro. And the thing is that this is almost always for major disruption in all hands evolution. I have an opportunity to give talks frequently to firefighters and police and other sort of, folks that we broadly put under the umbrella of first responders, and to kind of get their attention a little bit. I go, it's so good being with all you second responders today. And you can almost hear this growl come at me here. But I basically say, look, the real first responder is a family member, is a bystander, is a neighbor, is a colleague. And then you're the cavalry that comes in. We got to figure out how we democratize this. You know, we got to have the skills across our society. When you ask people to help, they almost always will step forward. And so that's key. We got to invite them into the preparedness efforts.
That's a great lead into our next question. So Elise asked, what can we do as the public to put our Texas vulnerable energy grid more at the forefront of leaders? So speaking to the civic engagement piece, what are things that, Joe Citizen can do to ensure that risk and resilience is top of mind? Is it as simple as voting in representatives that prioritize that as well? Is it writing a letter to your congressman? What is something that the general public can be doing on this front?
Judge, as a receiving end of those kinds of things, what's your recommendation?
Well, let's start with the fact that prior to the freeze, what we now call the freeze, how many people even knew what ERCOT was? How many people they may have heard of ERCOT, but I don't think there's a problem with getting the officials' attention. That's been done already. What is fascinating about the way you ask the question, people always say, well, we're going to vote in people that care about X, like winterization of the grid. But does that overcome people's opinion of hot button issues like abortion or taxes or all that? It's always a nice thing to say, we're only going to vote for people that are willing to winterize the Texas grid. But when push comes to shove, is that really going to be the issue that they vote on? I think not. However, the freeze got everybody's attention, and at the highest level, it will become an issue. It will become the subject of political ads going forward, and it'll mainly be aimed at the governor and at that level. I don't think you'll have state representatives or certainly city council or anybody like that, because those will still be more local issues. But it is one of those issues that could redefine what happens at the state level. And those come along periodically. And this one was it. Now, ironically, I live in the West University area of Houston, but I have a cabin, literally a log cabin up in East Texas. We didn't lose power at the log cabin because it wasn't part of ERCOT. It's actually part of a grid that goes all the way up into Canada. I didn't know that, and I consider myself fairly informed. So I think the winter freeze has gotten the attention at the top level, but I think by November of 2022, is that what people are going to vote for? Probably not. Something else will have come along.
Part of our real challenge here, and I think the judge, laid it out here with the public. There's a lot on its mind, but one of it often isn't infrastructure until it's not there anymore. It's kind of like the air we breathe. You take it for granted until you don't have it anymore. Part of the challenge is we've made our infrastructure almost invisible, even though it's in plain sight. People, turn a faucet on or flush a toilet, they get water, they throw a switch, they get electricity, and they have no idea what generates that. And part of the issue here is that we have to really up our literacy, on the foundations that actually make for modern life, and make it clear that we're like a generation who's inherited our grandparents' mansion. And we decide we can't afford to do the upkeep. People are driving by going, hey, nice house. Yeah, the plumbing's crap. The wiring doesn't work anymore. The roof leaks, right? But hey, yeah, nice house. It's unbelievable. We are a wealthier nation today than the generations who built the stuff in the first place. They put their ingenuity, they put their sweat and capital into this, and they also, in some cases, put their blood into it here to build what we have today. And to not treat it like an inheritance that we have to pass on and improve on to our next generation, I don't know how we lost our way with that. That we just take it all for granted. But part of the challenge is the systems are more complex. They're more sprawling. As the judge was saying, you got a cabin in West Texas, and it turns out it's got its power from Canada. that makes it pretty hard for us to get our minds around. Most of it was built as a local infrastructure. We wanted power, so we created a power station, and we had a substation, and we connected wires to it. But now we rely on much more complex systems. So communicating this complexity, that's why I'm so delighted to be talking to this group, because that's part of what we do. The risk is that these more hyper-connected, interdependent systems translate into, when there's a local shock, they tend to cascade in far more costly ways. And we're just going to end up in a place where we can't afford to keep doing what we're doing.
But let me follow up, because Steve touched on something. The hidden issue that I think is coming, it was touched on a little bit during the winter freeze, but the whole water system that we have, particularly in a place like Houston, how much of the water that's actually produced is leaked out in a pipe system that is beyond antiquated? A whole lot. I know I've had conversations with former Mayor Bill White, former Mayor Anise Parker, and everybody knows that the water system under the city of Houston is a problem. Well, then when the winter freeze comes along, that problem was exacerbated by the lack of generating power. And so people went without water for a long time. Going without electricity is one thing. Going without water is something totally different. And that could be the next crisis. We've already been alerted to it. This is where Steve and his team talk all the time. If you're alerted to something, then do you pay attention to it now? And my answer is probably they're not going to do that yet. And somebody's going to inherit a water system that completely fails. And everybody's going to say, well, why didn't you do something about it? That's where I get frustrated in this whole conversation about resilience.
Dr. Flynn, you touched on this, but as you noted, we are among a group of communicators. So I'm chomping at the bit to ask this next question, but what do each of you consider the role of communications in disaster response and recovery?
It is absolutely critical, because again, with a successful disaster response and recovery is requiring lots of people who don't usually play well together with each other to play well together, including civil society. And you don't get there from here if you don't communicate need and also give people a sense of direction for how they can help fulfill that need. Right? And part of the thing we lost our way 20 plus years ago on security post 9/11 is, almost the mantra after 9/11 was, look, the government is going to keep you safe. You can shop and travel. You go about your lives. We'll take care of you. Well, that was a false, that was a promise the government couldn't deliver on, and missed an opportunity, which is, I have to share with you information about risk, but I also need to empower you to act on that risk so that you feel like a part of the solution. Where we fall short, I think, on the government often side of public, the side here is, treating essentially the public like they were children, and I don't want to scare them. We don't want to tell them too much. You don't want to create fear by highlighting just a threat, but you want to help people understand, well, this is why you can be empowered to respond to that threat, and maybe investing more, or you can live with the risk. Let's be candid with people about, okay, here's what we got. If this fails, here's what the consequence is. You want to do something about that? If we don't talk very candidly in those ways, we're not likely to get, to a better place. So the communications challenge is absolutely key. And I will tell you, this is happening in boardrooms now, major corporations. They're looking at resilience indicators to decide where they're going to locate their headquarters, or where they're going to locate a major, manufacturing facility. It's not just the tax breaks you give. It's not just, okay, workforce may be there and low cost. They're looking at, if there is a storm, is this place going to shut down and not be able to get back up? And it's not just the CEOs doing this. This is their boards, the head of the audit boards. They're pushing them. And COVID accelerated this because so many companies turned out to be unprepared for the pandemic. And for some of us who've been working on pandemics as an issue here, a little bit of frustration over how the basic block and tackling wasn't being addressed. But in any event, we're in a much different place. So where you'll start seeing the need to communicate, it should be the Chamber of Commerce should be pounding their chest going, we're a community that, yeah, we may be exposed to hurricanes or fire or ice storms. We can ride it out. Look what we got. That's going to be increasingly appealing to folks who make decisions, who have a choice about where they live and where they invest. And they're going to flee the jurisdictions that can't deliver on those things.
In terms of communication, let me take a crack at what happens when you actually have an event. First and foremost, that sounds silly to say it, but tell the truth. I mean, stand there and actually tell the public the truth, as much of the truth as they need. Because if you try and bury them with information, then it gets mixed. But have a couple of key points. And the best example I can give of that, right after I became county judge, a statewide elected official, a fellow Republican, told me, he said, you know, your job is to make Bill White look bad. Well, Bill White was the mayor of Houston, a Democrat, and everybody knew that he was going to go run for some other office. And I just kind of shook my head and I said, no, that's not my job. You know, my job's to work with whoever's there. And boy, did that turn out to be one of the greatest decisions I ever made, because when Hurricane Ike came, a year and a half or so later, Mayor White and I had to work together. And even though the county judge is by statute the director of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, I quickly recognized the fact that more people know what a mayor is than know what a county judge is. And so, particularly at the national media level, they all want to talk to the mayor of Houston. They don't even know what a county judge of Harris County is. So Mayor White and I decided early on that we would have all our press conferences jointly. And we even got to the point where we would exchange notes. We would decide to alternate who was going to go first at each press conference. And we'd exchange notes to be sure that we were saying the same thing. So it's the unified message that has to be given, and it has to have no partisan tint to it. And the other piece that I would add is sometimes you need other people to speak. And my favorite, for those of you in the Houston area, you know who Jeff Lindner is. He's the meteorologist for the Harris County Flood Control District. Well, during one of the early storms, Jeff, who was not the director of flood control, briefed the flood control director, who then briefed somebody, who then briefed me. And then I went out there and made this statement. And about halfway through, I realized, why am I making this statement? Jeff's the one that ought to be out here. Well, that was almost unheard of. You can't have somebody 3 rungs down the ladder out in front of the press. And I'm going, yeah, but he's the expert. Why not? And so today people expect to see Jeff Lindner, and that was something that was set in motion, 13 or 14 years ago. So have the right person delivering the message and make sure that the message is unified. And I think the public appreciates that a great deal.
So for the organizations, both public and private, who are getting it right when it comes to preparation and risk analysis and things like that, how can resiliency investments in our community best be communicated to businesses and organizations looking to relocate to our region? This is a question coming from audience member Amy, who is with the Greater Houston Builders Association. But how do we promote and make our region attractive to people when we understand that we are doing the right steps when it comes to preparation and readiness?
No, I'm going to jump in first because I just have a very short example. The Associated Press, I want to say 3 or 4 years ago, put out a story, and it said, these are the cities that are likely to disappear by the year, I forget what year they said. And the 3 cities were Miami, New Orleans, and Houston, because of climate change and sea level rise. And I read it and I thought, well, this doesn't make any sense. I mean, Miami's on the coast, New Orleans is already below sea level, but Houston's 50 to 60 feet above sea level. It's not going to go underwater regardless. But in the article, it said the reason Houston is going to go underwater is because we're pumping groundwater and subsidence is occurring. Well, that's just false. Houston and Galveston and the legislature allowed the creation of the subsidence district back in the late 70s and early 80s. And we don't pump groundwater and we're not sinking. And why do I bring that up? Because I called the Chronicle and I said, you can't run this story. This is just not true. And so what we need communicators to do is whenever they see false information, to push back quickly against it, to make sure that, because somebody in Germany looking to locate a plant happens to read an article that says, well, Houston's sinking into the Gulf of Mexico, then that becomes a fact in their mind. And so we not only have to tout what we've done, but we also have to recognize that there are negative things being put out there that aren't true.
I think one way to get out in front of this is, and that's the key to get out in front of it, is to actually do what we call a baseline resilience assessment of communities. We think about, it came out of the 70s was you can't do a new development unless you've done an environmental impact assessment. Well, we should step back and do a community resilience baseline to basically say, well, where are we? Because if we don't measure these things, it's going to be very difficult for us to, for people who want to care, or to figure out where we should put the dollars, and get the biggest bang for the buck. We roughly have defined this around about 75 resilience indicators, so it's a little bit complex, but they're in, not surprisingly, 4 buckets that are pretty sensible. There's actually social capital. We know that basically some communities with a strong social capital, when you put under stress, they come together. This was a part of we had our experience in 2013 with the marathon bombing up in Boston, and coined something that came out of it, Boston Strong. It turned out there was a lot of capital in the community, social capital, and the community really came together, even under stress. So social capital, we can measure pieces of that. It's the existence of faith-based organizations and nonprofits and all the things of volunteerism that goes on that makes stitch a community together, makes it worth living. There's economic, obviously a very poor place, with no business, that's aging, that's losing players, not going to be resilient to a disruption. It's going to accelerate that trend. So there's things we can measure about an economic vitality. There's basic systems, infrastructure in the built environment, as well as the natural environment, and how those two connect or interconnect. And that's what climate leads us to do, to take a look at those things. And that is something, again, we can also measure. So, and then last is the governance. If we're so polarized, people aren't talking to each other, committees can't do anything, run away from that community, because under stress, they're not going to behave the way that Judge Emmett behaved, working with the mayor of mayor of Houston. The governance is key. And so you look at those 4 things and you have them in good place, you should brag about them. But we got to start assessing this if we're going to get to a place where we're really going to start driving the kind of behavior. And there's a lot that we can do. This is not rocket science.
So our next question can kind of speak a little bit more to the assessment piece. When it comes to evaluating resilience, there's obviously some of the structural things, but what we saw with the Colonial Pipeline, I know that more and more people are paying closer attention to cybersecurity elements. So is cybersecurity part of the recommended planning process? How do you measure that?
Absolutely. It is, one of the trends, and it's kind of amazing. If you go back to 2007, we had very few physical assets connected to the internet. I mean, it almost seems like that was, light years away, but that was 2007. By 2025, we'll be up to 38 billion devices tied to the internet. And that's, from our toaster talking to our laundry machine, our dryer to our smartphone and all the rest of it here. Every time we make a connection, we create a dependency, and we create potential vulnerability if that connection is severed. What we've been doing is racing to get these efficiencies that come from embedding devices and everything without thinking through, well, what if they're disrupted? And so a key element of resilience, again, is mapping out those connections, those dependencies, and then asking yourself, if this was broken, can you cope? And if the answer is no, I'm solely dependent on this smartphone and I'll get lost if I don't have it, then you're in trouble, because there's almost certainly going to be a day where the cell's going to go down and you're not going to be able to do that. So part of the challenge here is whenever we develop a system to grab that greater efficiency, we have to think it through, but what if? And if we do that as a part of it, it'll basically be a long-term, investment, long-term outcome, which would be quite positive. If we don't, we're going to keep getting surprised. The Colonial Pipeline, again, is a perfect illustration, not only of vulnerability because of the cyber, it's called cyber physical, when we connect physical parts of it to the internet. Why do we do that? Well, it's a lot easier to monitor. We used to send people out to walk up and down the line. Well, if I put a sensor on it, and then that could just tell me back in my climate controlled operations center what's going on with the pipeline. Cool. Except now somebody can come into it and attack it and turn down your system. So that's where we get to be a problem, is when we really have to evaluate if things are truly critical, you better get it off the net. You better get the crown jewels away from the internet. That's where we are right now. And for the things that have to be on there, you better think of contingency of how to deal with that. So bottom line, it's integrated. And for the last word about the Colonial Pipeline, the Northeast now is more dependent than it was 10 years ago on the pipeline because we shut down refineries, right? And so there's less infrastructure produced, and we're more dependent on this pipeline. And it's not just communities. There are 5 military installations that need to get their fuel from that pipeline that were in danger of not getting that if we hadn't get it back up and running. So it's a national security issue. Really got to step up our game on cybersecurity.
Cybersecurity is probably the most important factor going forward. And it's the thing that most of us know the least about. People like Dr. Flynn and his team, they've been talking about this for well over a decade. That is the biggest risk I think we have to resilience. Mother Nature is one thing that's going to come and that's going to go, but cybersecurity is absolutely going to be the key. And to give you an idea of how little people understand about it and how politics interferes, I've read a lot of people who said that they want to somehow blame the Biden administration for not authorizing the Keystone Pipeline, and that's what's caused the gas shortages on the East Coast. Well, it has nothing to do with it. Keystone, even if it was in place, is a crude oil pipeline. Colonial is a refined products pipeline, and people don't know that. And so when the politicians get in and just muck up the message, it's not to anybody's benefit. But I can't say strongly enough, cybersecurity is the biggest threat. And unfortunately, it is the least understood by the general public. And there are fewer experts on dealing with it than probably anything else. But I'm hopeful because, I've got kids and grandkids that seem to know all about this kind of stuff, and they'll take over soon, and hopefully they'll make us resilient.
Absolutely. Judge Emmett, you bring up a good point, and it flows nicely into our next question from Jackie. We've seen in recent years that there has been wavering public confidence in public institutions, government officials, and even media. People aren't sure who to trust anymore. So is there a way around that? Or what do we as communicators need to be thinking through when we want to establish public trust?
Oh my, that could be a whole afternoon session on its own. We've spent so much time tearing down each other politically and tearing down institutions. It's hard to build them back up. I mean, I'll give you an example. We now live in a world where talk shows, for example, you have a talk show host and they'll spend 2 years trashing some politician, and then they'll turn around and tell you need to vote for them. Well, it doesn't work like that. Or we have a situation, I'll go ahead and be blunt, at the state level in Texas, some state officials have just been doing everything they can to undercut local officials because maybe they're the different party. In my case, I was of the same party and they still did it to me. Well, the local officials and state officials need to support each other, need to know their roles. I got that. But this idea that you're constantly fighting with them, and then when a disaster hits, suddenly you've got to lock arms and go together, doesn't work so well. So, and you didn't ask this question, but I'm going to answer it because I like to do that sort of thing. Uh, the biggest problem in the midst of a disaster, in my mind, sometimes are the politicians or the talking heads that just sort of pop in on a political front. Um, I can't be gentle about this. You have members of Congress, for example, who you never hear from, but suddenly they want to be in front of the cameras when a disaster occurs. Well, it doesn't work like that because they're not on the ground day in and day out. And then we have on the national media, and I am going to name a name in this case, a man named General Honore. Yeah, General Honore was very involved in New Orleans and Katrina. And he goes on CNN during Harvey, the rains of Harvey. It was not a hurricane, it was a rainstorm for us, and says, well, they should have evacuated. Well, there was no way you could have evacuated the Houston area 5 days in advance. On a clear day, go out and say everybody has to close their business and leave town. We would have been laughed at and it wouldn't have worked. But then Mayor Turner and I had to spend an inordinate number of hours answering questions about why didn't we evacuate the area, all because of one person who wasn't even here, who knew nothing about what was going on the ground, made a statement on national television. So it's those externalities that come into play that cause problems, and somehow we need to keep them out. And so those of you who are in the communications business, help us do that.
One area, and it's why I do what I'm doing, and I'm thrilled Judge Emmett has landed at Rice University and is affiliated with me, though it's something I'm passionate about. And I mean, the challenge here is trusted sources. Where do we find trusted sources? And we're all a bit tarnished. There isn't any, nobody's perfect, but our institutions of higher education, our universities and colleges are a national asset, and there's expertise often there. Some of them are not the best communicators, so that's something I work on with my faculty members, but to try to do better at. But the bottom line is they have a responsibility to get the facts out, not to sit on the sidelines and study the problem, but I think also to be very sort of forward-leaning on helping. One of the things we did in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic and back in March, because I found that the Centers for Disease Control was not doing a public awareness campaign for how to be safe in the event of a contagious disease. So we put together with with faculty from our health sciences and the School of Pharmacy and so forth, just a basic primer, how to be safe and resilient in the face of a pandemic, and just put it out there. And happily, it went on its way. But I think communicators establish the relationships with people who are expert. Again, they may not be the best person to put in front of a microphone in front of, but they're always a good to go to. And you'll find most faculty, like I'm doing right now, are willing to talk. They like to talk. So build some bridges with those experts by making the outreach. I often say about my academic colleagues, it's not that they don't want to solve real problems, they just don't know any real people. So part of the challenge here is making the connections with the folks who are out there talking about this. And so you have these sources, and they're not just the folks who just stand up, rush in front of CNN, to be dubbed the expert because they're the first one in front of the TV camera. That unfortunately happens way too often these days.
So I know we're running short on time, but getting a lot of really great information. So you've shared a lot of great guidance today, both of you, about the communicator's role in disaster response and recovery. But if you had to boil it down to one key lesson that you would want communicators to know about disaster response and resilience, what would that be?
Tell the truth, have the right person delivering the message, and make sure you don't have conflicting messages. I mean, that sounds simple, but it's often hard to keep other people from coming in or impinging on your message. And part of that just becomes trust. And now Texas kind of backed into a situation, and I hope they don't change it. But after 9/11 is when they said, okay, each county, the county judge is the director of Homeland Security Emergency Management. That was a very good thing because it cleared up. Like Harris County has 34 cities. Yeah, the city of Houston is the biggest, but who speaks for who? And by having one person now, You can argue over whether that person's saying the right thing or not, but at least it clarifies. And I hope that stays the case going forward. And so the Jeff Lindner example is another one. Sometimes, check your ego and let somebody else deliver it because they're a more trusted source. And I think you're seeing that, and I hate to bring up the name because it's become somewhat controversial, but Dr. Fauci, for example, became the face, and some people like it, some people don't, but still it became a focus of the message. And so that's important. Always have to focus the message.
I guess I might say, cheat a little bit, maybe two. One is you need to do your homework. I mean, really is a case where if you're going to report on or communicate around a disaster, I mean, it is life and death often. These stakes are quite high. And so you really want to be careful, to get your facts as straight as you can get them, or go again to sources that can get you there. And ideally, a little bit of advanced reading, as a professor in me, will go a long way. The second, I think it's very important in communicating, it's a point I tried to make a little bit earlier. If we communicate about a threat or communicate about a hazard, we should always be thinking about how can I empower somebody to deal with that threat or hazard. Don't just stoke the shock information. Provide people with information about what they can do. And some of it's just very basic. I mean, it really is, shelter in place, or it's if you're able-bodied, go check on a neighbor who's not able-bodied and make sure they're okay. There are basic messages that we know are key in getting through any disaster or disruption that if you communicate, give people a sense of calm and a willingness actually to deal with the uncertainties that any disaster also has. So communicate as clearly and factually as you can about the threat or hazard, but also always try to bookend that with information about what your audience can do about it, what they can be empowered to do. Then it becomes less scary.
I think that's a great spot for us to wrap up. Dr. Flynn, Judge Emmett, thank you so much for your insights today. So many valuable tidbits of information being shared. So I know I'm appreciative as well as the group. So thank you so much. With that, I'm going to hand it back over.
Well, hang on just a second.
Sorry, go ahead, Judge Emmett.
20 seconds. I have to tout something that Steve Flynn and his operation have. We can share information. He's created the Global Resilience Research Network, which are academic institutions and all over the globe that get together to share information. That's important too. And so I wanted to be sure I mentioned that people should pay attention to what goes on in other parts of the world.
Thank you, Judge.